Hello everyone. So, we are into the week 2 of this course, and in the last lecture we have been talking about the right to water, which is basically onto the water rights. We did talk about how United Nations has accepted the right to water and sanitation as basic human right basic human right in its General Assembly in 2010, although there has been talks much before. So, we did discuss about the basics of right to water in the earlier lecture, and in this lecture we will be talking about the main features of right to sanitation, which is again a very integral part of the holistic water management system, because the management of sanitation facilities or wastewater again is one of the essential component for overall management of water. So, we will be talking about the right to sanitation in this lecture. To start with, usually when we talk about like water, many people consider water and sanitation together. So, UN resolution which referred to right to water and sanitation has actually considered water and sanitation as two distinct rights, two separate rights. However, often many organizations, institutions, even nations give preference to the water, and in that sense sanitation is neglected. That is the case in many countries, many developing countries particularly, and India is no exception. So, if you happen to see the status of India, the data from India which we basically discussed earlier also, if you recall. So, the status of sanitation is much worse than the status of supply. If you recall those numbers, in terms of water supply, our urban, at least urban population is around 80% of urban population is somehow fed with the water supply, but in sanitation we barely go around even up to 40%. So, that is the situation, and that is the practice in various other developing countries, and of course underdeveloped countries it is even worse the case. So, the sanitation neglecting this sanitation actually is causing another sort of problem, and in UN resolution when it was discussed at length, so it was discussed that sanitation is also very important and should be given due emphasis, should be considered or should be financed to manage with due importance and should not be ignored in the purview of water management. So, it is important to think that right of water and sanitation as separate rights, because although the human right to water and sanitation are closely related, the activities both are closely related, okay, but they have some very peculiar, some very important differences. Okay. For example, the privacy and dignity are of very high importance for right to sanitation, which may not be that important for right to water. One won't mind seeing somebody like a particular is not likely to mind if someone else sees him filling a bucket of water from a public tap or from a tap, but he would definitely mind if someone sees him during his usual sanitation practices. So, that is why there is like sanitation has few of its own distinct feature which should be considered and given due importance. So, further, not all sanitation solutions rely on waterborne systems. Some sanitation solution could be depending onto the alternate solution. When water and sanitation are considered as two separate rights, particular attention can be paid to the specific standards for the right of sanitation as well, and that will likely to trigger a more focused attention, a more in-depth and serious attempt in order to manage the sanitation, and that is what is the aim towards the realization of right to sanitation. So the right to sanitation and right to water, although closely related, should be considered, should be given due importance in considering them as a separate rights, two distinct rights. That is what was discussed in the United Nations. So what actually, in order to describe the meaning of water and sanitation as distinct rights, the content categories has been developed separately. So content category was developed under general comment number 15 on the right to water, whereas there was a separate statement released on by the UN Committee on Economics and Social Cultural Rights in November 2010 meeting. After that, right to water and sanitation was passed under United Nations General Assembly in July 2010. So in November 2010, in the Committee of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights released different distinct content onto the right to water under its general comment number 15 and a particular statement on sanitation. So they basically the statement on sanitation which was released is available onto this web source. Okay, it's basically released by the Economic and Social Council under United Nations. There were 8 distinct important points, of which mainly the first few are actually the status, making status aware, like the lack of access of sanitation and that affecting human dignity, undermining the enjoyment of social and cultural rights. So some basic information then about the issues, how these issues are there, the awareness rising is needed in order to accelerate the progress into the sanitation management. So all these issues were discussed separately. These points were released that despite some positive development, there is still significant lagging in the sanitation management facilities, and they actually sort of realized that sanitation is one of the most off track targets of the Millennium Development Goals. Okay. So they again, some numbers were estimated, like there is additional 1,000 million people were left without access to the improved sanitation. So these kind of, some of these points were raised, were discussed in detail. There is sort of, they identified the gap in the outcome, in their outcome document of the high level plenary meeting of the General Assembly held in September 2010 on the theme keeping the promise of united to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And as we were discussing, sanitation is the most off track target under that. Overall estimates suggested that around 2.6 billion people do not have access to improved sanitation. Okay. And in developing countries, around 80% of the wastewater is untreated and goes directly to the lakes, rivers and oceans. So this was also all these issues were discussed. Okay. The consequences of these improper sanitation practices resulting into the diarrhea was actually identified as the second biggest cause of the death of children under 5. Girls and boys, the school issues were also discussed over there. So these were the primary points, some of the points that were highlighted. So overall, the committee actually reaffirmed that sanitation is a fundamental human survival, sanitation is fundamental for basic human survival, for leading a dignified life and right to sanitation is an essential component, uh, inclusive of all the other international human rights. So, they again sort of stated as per the general comment that was there, the definition of a sanitation rights proposed in that statement by the independent expert on water and sanitation was a system for the collection, transport, treatment and disposal or reuse of human excreta and associated hygiene. So, this is what was sort of considered the definition, and under the right the committee affirmed in its statement that states must ensure everyone without discrimination the physical, affordable access to sanitation in all sphere of life which is safe, hygienic, secure, socially and culturally acceptable, provides privacy and ensure dignity. So, similar to the right to water which we discussed earlier, the committee released a statement on to the right to sanitation, and the various aspects of sanitation was given due importance for the discussion. So, if we go on to the decoding right to sanitation as we did with the right to water in our previous lecture, the right to sanitation also has some distinct feature that it demands certain specific type of sanitation facilities must be made available to the all citizens without discrimination. So, what was these important points? So, one was the availability and physical accessibility. Okay. So, some of the points are actually similar to the right to water, but if you see as like we just talked earlier also, that sanitation additionally has some further distinct features, and that was considered by the expert committee in releasing the statement and in decoding what exactly the right to sanitation is sort of refers. So, the availability and physical acceptability was one of the prime factors of right to sanitation. So, sanitation facility must be available for everyone in household or immediate vicinity. So, similar to right to water, one should not basically ask to walk down couple of kilometers to for sort of their sanitation needs. Further, there must be a sufficient number to ensure that the needs of the people are met and waiting time are not unreasonably long. Okay. So, like for public toilets or common places and all that, if a government is building a public toilet in a village with a population of let us say 500 people just, and they are just creating 2-3 toilets. So, you can assume that what degree of rush is expected in front of those toilets, particularly in the morning hours. So, that is again not acceptable. When we say that it should be available and physically accessible, that means it should be available in reasonable amount of time, and waiting time should not be unreasonably long. That is one of the points that was discussed. Then when we say that sanitation facility must be available, so sanitation facility as was basically pointed out by the expert in that meeting, that sanitation is only considered available when all the aspects are available, like the collection, the transport, the treatment, the disposal or reuse are all available under hygienic conditions. So, that is what essentially means the availability of sanitation facility. It just does not mean that you one creates a loo room and then after that forgets. That is not a proper sanitation facility. the sanitation facility should have in operation management facility included, including all these features like collection, transport, or its further treatment or disposal or reuse, whatever it is. So that is to be observed, or that is to be seen when basically considering this about sanitation facilities. So that is what was indicated based on the availability of, and physical accessibility. The facilities must be within easy reach and with safe paths to get there, and located in a safe area including at night. That was another important point discussed, that when we make certain sanitation facility available, it should be easily approachable as well. So there must be safe paths and should be accessible in the darker phase of the day, that is night actually. So in the safe area. Then the design of sanitation facility needs to be adapted to the everyone actually who can use them. So if it is basically a sanitation facility is being made for a village, or for a common sanitation facility is being developed by the government, for example, so it should basically be capable of serving older persons, children's, person with disabilities, or chronically ill people, pregnant women. So all these criteria needs to be properly thought out before designing. This actually need of the individual have implications onto the, like when we say that the facility must be able to serve a variety of the people, a various section of the community, including children, women, older persons, disabled persons. So that means that design has to be appropriate with all the features, like there may be requirement of a sort of larger entrance size, okay, in the sanitation facility. The some specific interior space requirement must be there. There may be requirement of handrail for old age or unsupported people, or other support mechanism. The position of defecation, whether Indian system, Western systems, what kind of system is needed actually. So in like similar other aspects needs to be considered when we are talking about the availability and physical accessibility of the sanitation facility. So in terms of physical accessibility, it should be accessible in these features also. Now coming on to the acceptability. So again, when we talk about the acceptability in terms of water, we primarily talk about the aesthetic view of the water or the quality of water. We primarily relates with the quality of water. But in terms of sanitation, acceptability is more so onto the social front. Okay. So sanitation services must take into account the cultural and social preferences. So for example, if you give a western kind of toilet in an Indian rural village, that may not be acceptable to people. People are not culturally adopted to that kind of defecation practices. So similarly, if you provide an Indian toilet to some other country where people are not practiced to use this kind of defecation practices, they will not be able to use it. So whatever sanitation services is being provided is to be acceptable in terms of cultural need and preferences as well. So user should be basically how you can manage that. You can manage that when these things are being planned, one must involve individuals and communities in the planning of these services. One must understand the requirement of the section for which it is being provided, and the facility should be designed based on the requirement of the community. The toilets should ensure privacy and generally should be separate for separate sex. So typically a separate male and female toilets are encouraged, and moreover the defecation is such thing which people want to, usually one wants privacy while defecating. So this privacy must ensure, because if it is in an open space or open system, people will avoid going for toilets or going for defecation over those places. So that kind of facility, although maybe engineerily means technologically sound and everything, but may not be acceptable to public. So that also must be seen. Then these facilities should accommodate the common hygiene practices. Okay. Now again the hygiene practices are different at different places. Some people use water for cleaning, at some places or some countries paper is used for cleaning. So your toilet facility should have those kind of features incorporated in it, then only it will be acceptable. Like a Western world where paper is used for cleaning purpose, if you put such a system over in India where there is no water provision in the toilet, nobody is going to use that. Okay. Or you put water in reverse of this, you put this water facility and all that in a Western in a toilet in the waste, where people are habituated to use paper, and if there is no paper, so then they might find it difficult to adapt to that. So again the acceptability will depend on these features as well. As were discussing earlier, generally the toilet for this based on gender specific, like the female toilet should be separate from man, and generally toilet for women and girls must have facilities for disposal of menstrual material and their menstrual hygiene management as well. Then there is a aspect of affordability as well. So access to sanitation must be affordable to everyone. Similar discussion we had in the previous lecture about the water, that right to water ensures that water is made available at affordable cost. And for water purpose, if you recall, there was the WHO and agencies have suggested a number that it should be available at less than 3% monthly household income. No such number has been suggested for sanitation, but sanitation facilities also must be affordable for everyone. Affordable means it does not say that it has to be free of charge. Okay. So human right to water or sanitation do not call that services are to be provided for free. So that is not the objective actually of human right to water and sanitation, but affordability is a clause. So if it is not free, that does not mean one is entitled to price it as per the considering as per general market commodity where there is a profit making and all that, or the financial sustainability of business is involved. It should not be managed that way. The affordability should be ensured that for different sections of people. So somebody who has a greater willingness to pay can afford these services at higher tariffs, but the poor people, the deprived people who do not have that much capacity to pay or that much willingness to pay, should also be made sanitation facilities available at generally smaller, or what we can say is subsidized cost. Okay. So these services sort of which should be developed, although tariff and all that system should be developed, one may need actually government subsidies to ensure the affordability of these facilities to poorer section of the society. Now that is what exactly sort of being done over here. So if you see this the Prime Minister's scheme of creating toilet or giving subsidies for toilet. So those who are in a rural scale, those who are want to make toilet in their household, the government is providing some 10,000, a little over 10,000 rupees as a subsidy. So almost more than half of the cost, or around that much percent of the cost, is being shared by the government for that purpose, in order to promote the toilet facilities and cut down onto the open defecation under Swachh Bharat mission in our own country. So those kind of provisions are to be thought about in order to ensure the human right to sanitation. These are the basic features of human right to sanitation, similar to the human right to water, where the along with ensuring the water supply or the availability of adequate quantity and good quality water at affordable cost to its citizen, there is a state's responsibility under human right to sanitation to ensure the availability of sanitation facilities also under these various features. So sanitation, affordable sanitation facility, acceptable sanitation facility, and easily approachable sanitation facility is what needed. So that way, in combination, the human right to water and human right to sanitation, or generally the rights to water and sanitation, how typically UN refers it. So in combination, it ensures the right of the people to get safe and adequate facilities for grabbing, for acquiring, for meeting their water demands as well as sanitation practices. So with this we will stop this session, and in the subsequent session then we are going to talk about some of the features, some of the sort of features of any basic human right, and how what points need to be taken care while implementation of these rights. So we will discuss little about the implementation of these rights in the next lecture. Thank you.